Hi, hello. My name is Monica Lugo, and I will be talking to you today about trade negotiations. It is really an honor for me to be teaching this today, and I want to thank Amrita for inviting me to this class. So I'm going to try to be as clear as possible. I apologize in advance for any noise in the background or any mispronunciation or anything. I'm recording this from my home. I'm working from my home, and sometimes this could happen. So I hope I can be clear, and if you have any comment or any question, please do not hesitate to contact me. At the end of this presentation, you will have my email and all my social network information, so I'll be glad to answer any question you may have. So I'm going to start. I have prepared a small presentation, and I just want to talk to you about my experience because I was able to be the lead of several chapters in different trade negotiations in Mexico. And of course, I will talk to you about the Mexico's experience in trade and why it is so important to Mexico international trade. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about history. I think you know where Mexico is located. We are in North America, and of course our big neighbor is the biggest consumer in the world is the US, and our first trade partner. So as you know, also, you may know, Mexico in the 80s and in the 70s, and before that, we were a very closed economy. We didn't have any free trade agreements with anybody. It was, it is a period known as import substitution, where we thought it was better to be auto-sufficient and not to export or import any product at all. It was also really, really expensive to do that. So during the 80s, with all the economic crisis in the world, not only in Mexico, but also in the world, it was very difficult for Mexico to grow. We didn't have, as I said, this openness within the world, and we didn't have any trade agreements, basically. But in the 90s, we had a president that believed in liberalization in trade and in opening the economy at that time, known as, the neoliberal period here in Mexico. I don't know if you have studied that period within your studies, but here in Mexico, it was a very important period because the NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, was negotiated, and it was entered into force in 1994. And since then, Mexico growth was just incredible. We grew around, in 25 years, around 700%. And our exports diversified very much. And since then, Mexico was able to join into the big competitors in the world in terms of international trade. So to answer, I'm going to be answering some questions that Amrita asked me to. What are trade negotiations and why countries engage in them? Why is that? Why is so important? So this has to do with it. A closed economy is one that is not able to exchange a lot of products. Before, as I was mentioning, it was really expensive to do so. There were a lot of tariff barriers between countries, and also it was the cost of transportation was really expensive, but it was basically very difficult to export and to import our products. So also, as you may know, the international organizations were created also in the 90s, such as the we had the GATT before, but then we had the GATT became the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And within this, the trends in the global economy became to increase trade within the country. So Mexico is just one example of how trade liberalization became so important in the world. Mexico, as I was saying, was one of the first countries with the United States and Canada to have a free trade agreement so ambitious and including so many disciplines, not only the reduction of tariff for products, but also included trade rules, which means how are countries going to behave when exchanging goods and services, right? It was really important to set up these rules because, as we know right now, there are not only tariff barriers, we can find non-tariff barriers in terms of regulations of intellectual property, in terms of government procurement, and many other disciplines that became really important to accompany this trade liberalization, right? So that is why countries engage in free trade agreements, because the free trade agreements are, let's say, a kind of contract that set up the rules of how the countries or the governments will need to behave in the not only in the short term but in the very long term in terms of this exchange of goods and services, right? So the free trade agreements behave as, as a contract. Like when you rent a house, you have your terms and conditions, what you need to do, what are your obligations, and also what are your benefits, right? A free trade agreement is more or less the same thing. It's an agreement between 2 or 3 or more countries regarding how they are going to behave, what are the rules they are going to set up in terms of their exchange of goods and services, basically. What will be their rules in terms of tariffs, but also in terms of non-tariff barriers. And here, as I was mentioning, the World Trade Organization sets very big, framework of how things should be done, right? Because most of the countries belong to this organization. So if basically when you're making a free trade agreement, you use the WTO as an example or as a base of how your conditions are going to be set up and how you are going to behave and which rules you have to respect, right? So this is basically the purpose of doing that. Why do countries engage in trade negotiations? Because through trade, the economy grows. And as I was saying, not only that, there are a lot of implications. I'm going to show you an example with Mexico. Mexico, as I was saying, started trade openness in 1995 with the North American Free Trade Agreement known as NAFTA. But after that, we began to negotiate a lot of free trade agreements with the whole world. Right now, Mexico has 15 free trade agreements with 50 countries. We also have 32 bilateral investment agreements or treaties known as BITs, and we have 6 economic complementation agreements and 2 partial scope agreements. What is that and why they are with so many different names? Well, it depends, of course, in the level of ambition. The level of ambition, or how ambitious or how difficult a free trade agreement is, it depends on its name. For example, a free trade agreement includes a lot of disciplines, not only, as I was saying, tariff barriers, but also non-tariff barriers, and even other disciplines that we're going to see with the newest free trade agreements that include very, very new disciplines such as gender, such as environment, such as SMEs or e-commerce, for example. Those are the newest free trade agreements that are really ambitious and that really have focus on going beyond what really trade is. Trade is just the exchange of goods and services, as I was saying, but it also involves other things like labor, like the woman involvement in trade, or gender capacity, or many other things. So depending on the level of ambitious is how you see a free trade agreement. We have the bilateral investment treaties, which are only, as their name is saying, bilateral, or even more countries can be included in this agreement, but it's only specific to investment. So they are not regarding, tariffs or non-tariff barriers. They are just regarding how the country are going to protect their investment, the investment of the other country, and if it's going to be a state-to-state, dispute settlement mechanism, or is it going to be a company or state dispute settlement mechanism, and many other things, but it's only related to investment. Then we have in Mexico, the Economic Complementation Agreement, which means it doesn't include non-tariff barriers or other disciplines. It's more related to tariff and how the tariff is going to decrease in a period of time, or what are the level of the tariffs involved between 2 or 3 countries. In Mexico, we have 6. The most recent ones that we have been negotiating and that are not concluded in the negotiations are with Argentina and Brazil, for example. They include other disciplines as well. It could include non-tariff barrier disciplines, but is not as ambitious as a free trade agreement. Okay. Then we have the partial scope agreements, which mean it has very limited scope. It's a little bit similar to economic complementation agreements, but it may differ from including certain disciplines or not. It's not it depends a lot on the name of that every country wants to put on it. So it's not a definition specific for which one is an economic complementation agreement or which one is a partial scope. But either way, both of them are more ambitious than a free trade agreement, basically. So why countries engage in them again is because they are allow the country to grow, but also to include many other things. For example, in Mexico, it was really, really important, and I will show you in a little bit, for its economic growth, but also to have or to attract other kind of investment. Here, I wanted to show you this graphic because, as I was saying, in the late 70s of last century and the beginning of the 80s, Mexico had a very important exports of oil. It was an oil producer country, basically, and our exports depended a lot in this wood, in this precious wood. And I'm sure you may be related to that and to the whole crisis also, and to all the conflict within Middle East as well. Oil was in the 80s a very important commodity, and in Mexico we were a very important producer of oil. And most of our exports depended on that. Of course, when the oil price collapsed, it was a very significant crisis to Mexico. So within, and you can see it here, the implementation of NAFTA, which was in '94, exports in Mexico became more and more for other goods, and the oil exports declined, or they maintained the same, but they didn't were as important as other exports in Mexico. So what does that show us? That the free trade agreements allowed us to diversify our exports to become more and more important in other products that we had, such as, for example, agriculture, or of course manufacture. It's really important in Mexico and in other sectors. Mexico became very important in the automobile industry, in the aerospace industry, in the medical industry, and, as I said, in the agriculture industry. This is a graphic. I just wanted to update it because we just didn't have numbers in the other slide from after 2017. But in this graphic, I wanted to show you, this is the most recent numbers we had from our official statistics in Mexico. We had an increase here in, as you can see, in the last 20 years. Of course, this B is because of COVID and the pandemic, but as you can see, we are recovering and in a very fast pace within trade. This is total trade in Mexico since 2006 to 21, and these are I mean, in Spanish, it will be billions of dollars. So it's very important for Mexico, as you can see, the trade in order to recover economic growth. Another thing that is important for Mexico and why they engage in free trade agreements is not only the possibility to export and to increase the economy, it's also because it allows us to become more trustful within the international community, and we were able to sign other free trade agreements with other countries. Other countries, or the world in general, saw Mexico that if Mexico was able to become a very important partner for the US, then it could be a very important partner for them. So in terms of openness and trade liberalization, we increase very importantly. As you can see, this is from 1995. And this is, I didn't find more recent figures, and I'm sorry for that, but this is just an idea of how big the foreign direct investment had increased in the last 26 years. So you can see that most of the foreign direct investment in Mexico has come from our trade partners. So as I was saying in the other slide, we had a very important network of free trade agreements with 50 countries, more or less, which allowed us to have this foreign direct investment. Not only that, I think it's very important to know that when Mexico opened its economy to have the NAFTA, to become a partner with the US, we also became we had to become accountable, and we have to be very transparent in many things. So in that way, it helped also to strengthen our institutions to become a better democracy, and to have more and better laws that will provide this kind of assurance to the U.S. that Mexico was going to comply within our international obligations. So a lot of institutions were created, a lot of processes to avoid corruption were created, a lot of also processes to have accountability within the citizens were created, and within our free trade partners were created. So in terms of laws, internal laws to avoid, this, how do you say? I'm sorry, sometimes I forget words in English. But in order to become more, to assure the U.S. and to assure our free trade partners that we were going to comply, these laws were put in place. So Mexico became, as I was saying, a better country, a better democracy. We had better institutions, and we modernized not only our laws, but also our technological processes to be able to compete with the rest of the world, with China or some Asian countries, and be able to provide and to supply the materials and the things and the goods and services that the US and Canada needed us to do. So that is why it was so important for Mexico to do that. So as I was mentioning, there are so many free trade agreements with the world. And right now, there are many free trade agreements that we need to consider, and that are very important in the international scenario. As you may know, we had in the last, let's say, 10 years, Mexico has engaged with the whole world to have and to assure this trade liberalization. In Europe, for example, we modernized our free trade agreement with the European Union. We are still negotiating to modernize our free trade agreement with the European Free Trade Association, with EFTA, and we are negotiating, even if you may find this surprising, but we are negotiating with Turkey and with Jordan. Unfortunately, these negotiations had been suspended due to different priorities, let's say, in our administrations in the government. In Turkey, but also in Mexico, we had changed different priorities in terms of free trade agreements. So I know these negotiations had been suspended. But something that you may find interesting is that I negotiated the first chapter that was closed with the Mexico-Turkey's free trade agreement, which was competition. So I negotiated that chapter, and we were the first chapter to close and to have an agreement on, and that was really interesting. So also we have the Asia-Pacific integration in Mexico with the CPTPP, and right now there's been carried out, and recently it has been announced the conclusion of the negotiation to have Singapore as I'm sorry, there's a mistake there. It's Singapore in English, not in Spanish, but we just concluded negotiations to have Singapore as a associated state in the Pacific Alliance. And also we wanted to have more integration with Latin America. Negotiations with Ecuador are about to conclude, but they're still going on. There are many things going on in Pacific Alliance, the Pacific Alliance, and you will see it in the slides further, what all these free trade agreements are about. But it's one of the most ambitious free trade agreements that Mexico has. Also, we had a complementation economic agreement with Cuba, a free trade agreement with Panama, and as I was mentioning, the complementary agreements with Brazil and Argentina. So, as I was saying, what are the differences between free trade agreements? It's also the level of ambitions that you want to set up. And we have different examples. In Mexico, one of the most ambitions was, as I was saying, a Pacific Alliance, because the four countries, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, wanted to have an area of integration to ensure not only a complete freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people, but to assure that the four countries will have a deep integration, almost as much as the European Union. Of course, the European Union is very, very, very ambitious. It is not only economic, but also political. But here in Pacific Alliance, we wanted to do something a little bit more ambitious, just as any free trade agreement. So, and right now, Singapore has become a state alliance of this partnership, and it's becoming very, very important, Pacific Alliance as a free trade agreement. Also, the CPTPP, you know, it's a very important free trade agreement for Mexico. It was one of the first free trade agreements with the level of ambitions that was above everybody. You know, Pacific Alliance and the CPTPP were negotiated almost at the same time. So both of them are really ambitious. And as you can see, we were negotiating at the same time with for example, in CPTPP, we have Peru and Chile, and we were negotiating also Pacific Alliance with them. So it was sometimes it was a little bit funny when we wanted to compare notes and to see why are you accepting this provision in Pacific Alliance and you don't want to accept it in CPTPP. And we had very important discussions like that with Chile and Peru, for example. Colombia is not part of CPTPP; they didn't want it to join. But with Chile and Peru, they were really important. It was very, very fun, but also sometimes very complicated to deal with them and to deal with other free trade partners. For example, at the beginning, when the US was negotiating CPTPP and Canada, we had to be somehow allies because we were also trying to modernize NAFTA through the CPTPP. And we had to make alliance with Canada and the US, but also with Chile and Peru because of Pacific Alliance. And then we had to make, you know, everybody agree with what we wanted to set up there. So it was very interesting as a negotiator to deal with these negotiations at the same time. Also, well, as I was mentioning, the Pacific Alliance is negotiating with associated states. This was our plan B, you know, to negotiate as a Pacific Alliance with other countries such as New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and even Canada, to include them in case there was no CPTPP. When the US retired, you know, the first thing that Trump did was to pull out of the TPP. And we thought that when that happened, there was not going to be any interest of the other countries to continue the free trade agreement. So we plan to have you know, a plan B for in case that happened. Fortunately, the other countries, you know, decided to stay, and that's why TPP changed its name to CPTPP, and it's without the US. But still, it was interesting for other countries to remain in Pacific Alliance because there are different provisions, and there is a different view of how this should work. It's very technical. I don't want to go in detail through it, but there are certain differences that CPP will have from Pacific Alliance. So Pacific Alliance became attractive to these countries, and so they are on the list basically to enter as an associated state. And right now, as I said, the first associated state that it's part of Pacific Alliance is Singapore. But let's see how things came up in the future, and probably Australia and other countries, Canada, for example, may join as well. So why is important to have modernized the free trade agreements? Well, I think for Mexico, a very good example was NAFTA. And this happened when, also Trump came into power. Everything was working fine between Mexico, the US, and Canada. And when Trump entered into power, he said that NAFTA was the worst deal ever made by the US, and that Mexico was taking advantage of it, and he wanted to pull out of it. And basically, he had some kind of reason just in the fact that it wasn't reviewed, this free trade agreement. It was a very old agreement made more than 25 years ago. As I said, it was implemented in 1995, 94. Probably many of you haven't even born at that time. And what was missing was that, as you know, the economy has developed, and there are many different things that at the time they didn't existed, such as, for example, internet or e-commerce, or there were small businesses going on, but they were not included, and very many other provisions or disciplines that are important right now were not considered then. Because then, as I mentioned before, the only point of having a free trade agreement was to reduce tariffs and to just set down the rules of trade, but they were not including vulnerable groups or women or labor or any other thing that matters now, right? So they needed to be modernized, and Mexico realized that, around 4 years ago, more or less, in 2016, 2014, more or less, we started the modernization process of our free trade agreements, the most important ones. So we had our free trade agreement with the European Union modernized, and our free trade with the EFTA countries. Also, Brazil and Argentina, the economic complementary agreements were revised, and of course NAFTA, which now is called the USMCA. So just I'm just gonna go real fast with this. I don't want to take too much time, but many things were added. It is basically a new free trade agreement with the European Union. We have more access to markets. We strengthen the protection to investment and trade. And as we said, as I mentioned before, we had a very modern treaty which incorporates SMBs, environment, and anti-corruption disciplines. There's more, there are different topics. I don't want to bore you with this, but the problem is that right now this free trade agreement is paused as well. In Mexico, we have a new administration since 2018. So this government is not, it's a very left-wing has a very left-wing point of view, and they don't believe very much in openness and free trade. It's a little bit contradictory because that's our main source of growth and economic recovery right now after COVID, but things are the way they are. So right now it's paused, and I don't think it's going to conclude or accelerate the signature and the implementation until this administration is done. So that will be until 2024 probably, when we will know more about this free trade agreement. Also, the same happens with the rest of the free trade agreements that we were negotiating. The only one that I know that has been advancing is, as I mentioned, the State Alliance with Singapore in the Pacific Alliance, and the Ecuador negotiations. But the rest, I know that they have been a little bit paused. There's also the COVID restrictions, and there are not many possibilities to travel, even though there are video conferences and meetings. But unfortunately, there's no budget within the Mexican administration to continue these trade negotiations. So I know there had been paused. I wanted to talk to you real quick about the North American or the USMCA, and then to talk to you about a little bit about gender. So I already talked about why there are trade negotiations, why countries want to engage with them, what are the benefits of them, and what kind of agreements we have. But I think for Mexico, the USMCA, or the modernization of NAFTA, was a very crucial one. We as I said, and you can see the figures here, and I'm not going to repeat them, but for Mexico, this allowed us to be the country that we are right now. We are the 15th economy in the world. We have more than 126 million people that are consumers. Our economy depends largely in the US economy. So especially now with COVID, this free trade agreement has become even more important, as the US has been growing and putting on so many let's say, injection in the economy. Mexico has grown with it as well. And this is something that sometimes we don't even see the perspective of how much this, partnership is as important to Mexico. But I wanted to show you this, how much trade has grown since the implementation of the free trade agreements. And this is the reason why we signed them, and why we look to have them, to grow, to increase our production, to have better institutions, to have better jobs at the end of the day, and to have a more diversified options when we buy our food, when we buy our services, when you go to the bank, when you buy your things online, when you are able to select from 10 different options instead of just one. There's competition, there's productivity, and therefore everybody wins. It's a win-win in the economy. So it will be very important, and I think this could be some kind of homework if you go to the supermarket in your country and try to see how many products you have from other countries. I'm sure you don't find, just one thing only. There are so many different things. The fruits, the vegetables you eat, the meat you eat. But not only that, which banks do you have? How many, internet or access to cable you have? All these interactions are part of this agreement, and that's why they are so important, because at the end of the day, we are able to be more connected, to know more about other countries and to have the best of other countries. In Mexico, we just didn't used to have a lot of things, and right now, if you go to any grocery store, you have more than 10 options of any product. So, and it's not that expensive, you can shop or you can have anything basically that you want, because we have, e-commerce right now, and we have, it's quicker for us to have anything, even if it's coming from Asia. We just wait 2 or 3 weeks. That's it. Before, we used to wait 2 or 3 months or even more. So that is why this is so important. In Mexico also, and Canada, the North American integration is dependent. Not only Mexico depends on the US, but the US depends on Mexico and Canada as well. So it's a win-win for everybody. The foreign direct investment, and I showed you in another slide, but I just wanted to focus more about North America, has reached 471 billion US dollars in just North America. This is huge. And what are the news, or what are the changes done from NAFTA to the USMCA? Well, as I said, we had to modernize it. We included more and different chapters that we didn't have before because just they didn't exist, such as digital trade, communications, and also there are new sub issues that were not important at the moment in the 90s, but now they are very important right now, such as including new disciplines such as anti-corruption, but also including gender provisions or sustainability, environment, labor, other issues that now are very important. We were able to eliminate unacceptable proposals that were coming from the Trump administration, and that was something very difficult to do. And I think, I wanna acknowledge this on behalf of the Mexico's team of negotiators, but also the Canadian team, because there was a point where negotiations were very, very difficult, and we were basically able to lose everything because the Trump administration didn't understand how important we were for them. Until we show how important Mexico is to the US, they just didn't get it, right? We had to show them that by the most important states in the US depended or had as second or first trade partner Mexico, and not only that, those states were also very important politically. So as you know, in the US and the way the elections take place, some states are swing states, and basically if they are the ones that define the elections. And when we showed them to the Trump administration how some swing states depended on Mexico and how their constituents were going to lose if they pull out of the NAFTA or they didn't continue negotiating for the USMCA, they understood how important we were, and they were able to take out or eliminate these unacceptable proposals they wanted to leave in the agreement. Also, another thing that was very important was that we were able to set up a middle ground. And I just wanted to share a little bit about this because, for example, Canada was not accepting anything. When there were these unacceptable proposals from the US, Canada immediately left the table basically, and they said no, we don't want this, and they wanted to go away. And Mexico showed that it was very important to go through a middle ground and to make another counter-proposal and to reach an agreement with them, but in a different way, right? Without accepting the unacceptable, we wanted to make more propositions. So that, I think that was very important for Mexico to were able to negotiate with the Trump administration in particular. And then, and something else that was very important in the USMCA was to include this new inclusive and responsible, chapters, as I was mentioning before, that are part of the modernization process that have to do with SMEs, labor, environment, and gender. So I don't want to take more time. The USMCA, and in Spanish is called TEMEC, in French is called COSMA, but basically this is what we ended up with. I think it was a very historical thing that we were able to agree with the Trump administration. And for Mexico, at the end of the day, it was a very good agreement after all. So we preserve the free trade, we guarantee certainty in trade and investments, and we continue strengthening North America competitiveness, and we modernize their discipline. So you have it there. We were able to do that. And I just wanted to talk about a little bit trade and gender because Amrita asked me to do so, but in the USMCA, it was a very difficult situation because of the Trump administration and the way their views of what they wanted. And Mexico and Canada made a proposal to include a gender chapter in the free trade agreement. But because of this, because of the Trump administration, they rejected it. It was a no. They didn't want to have anything to do with gender whatsoever. So what we wanted to push and really include was to have some disciplines, at least, all around the free trade agreement. So you will see in the USMCA, if you look at it, it doesn't have a gender chapter, but there are important provisions all along the free trade agreement in the labor chapter, in the SMEs chapter, and other like cultural exclusions and other chapters that talk about gender provisions. The important thing here is that all these provisions are in chapters that are subject to the dispute settlement mechanism. And unlike if we were going to have a chapter, a complete chapter, even though it was really good because it acknowledged the importance of having gender provisions in a free trade agreement, unfortunately, the proposal that was presented didn't include this chapter in the dispute settlement mechanism. So we ended up having a free trade agreement without the gender chapter in it, but we had gender provisions all along the free trade agreement, but that are in chapters that are subject to the dispute settlement mechanism. And what does that mean? That in case of not compliance of these provisions, that have more teeth or has more consequences towards the parties that are not going to comply with it. So at the end of the day, I think that it's not ideal, but we have a good outcome within the gender provisions. And of course, there are a lot of things to be done still regarding gender, but hopefully, in the revision of the USMCA, we can include more provisions or even, think about in having a whole chapter of gender that is subject to the dispute settlement mechanism. So I think I am going to finish my presentation here. I hope I was clear. I hope I made my point. And if you have any question, please ask me directly. You have my email there, or you can ask Amrita, and I'll be glad to answer anything. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.